Before I tell you what happened in that will reading, I need you to understand something. This story isn't about love. It's not about an old woman finding happiness in her final years. This is about what happens when a 70-year-old billionaire announces she's pregnant by her 32-year-old gardener. About a family that spent 6 months planning how to erase both the pregnancy and the man. About a will reading where security footage, DNA results, and hidden recordings were played in front of lawyers, cameras, and a room full of people who thought they could control the narrative. And about how, in the end, the truth didn't set anyone free. It destroyed them. If you think you know where this is going, you don't, because what makes this story unforgettable isn't the pregnancy. It's not even the age gap. It's what the family did when they found out. And it's what was written in that will that no one, not even the lawyers, saw coming. Hit that subscribe button right now. You're going to want to follow this channel after you hear what happens next. And drop a comment, just type, "I'm ready," if you're prepared to hear how a single document can dismantle a dynasty built over 70 years. Because once you know what was in that will, you'll never look at family the same way again. Let's begin. The garden smelled of turned earth and something sweeter, jasmine maybe, or the faint mineral scent of water on hot stone. It was early morning in Nairobi, the kind of dawn that arrives with the city still half asleep, when the light comes soft through the jacaranda trees and the streets haven't yet filled with the noise of matatus and hawkers and the relentless push of a day. Samuel Kimani was on his knees in the dirt, hands dark with soil, pulling weeds from around a bed of succulents that had been planted by someone who understood patience. He had been working at the Whitmore estate for 8 months. 8 months of early mornings and careful hands. 8 months of being invisible. The estate belonged to Margaret Whitmore, 70 years old, British by birth, Kenyan by 40 years of residency, and a fortune built on tea plantations, real estate, and the kind of investments that multiply quietly in offshore accounts. She was the kind of woman people spoke about in whispers, not because she was cruel, but because she was untouchable. Wealth like hers didn't just buy comfort, it bought silence, it bought loyalty, it bought the ability to shape reality to her preferences. She had outlived 2 husbands, raised no children of her own, and built an empire that employed hundreds and supported dozens of family members who had learned to depend on her generosity the way plants depend on rain. Samuel was not supposed to matter. He was a gardener, poor, 32 years old. He had come to Nairobi from a village near Kisumu, looking for work that would send money home to his mother and 3 younger siblings. He had learned to garden from his grandfather, who had tended the grounds of a colonial-era hotel and who had taught him that soil has memory, that if you treat it with respect, it gives back. Samuel believed in that. He believed in work. He believed that if you kept your head down and your hands busy, life would eventually offer you something more than survival. He did not believe he would end up in the bed of a 70-year-old billionaire. And yet, it started the way these things always start. Small, plausible. A conversation about a struggling hibiscus. A comment about the way he pruned the roses. Margaret Whitmore was not a woman who spoke to staff casually. She had housekeepers, drivers, cooks, all of whom moved through her life with the kind of trained invisibility that money demands. But she noticed Samuel, the way he worked, the care he took. One afternoon she asked him about a plant she couldn't identify, and he told her it was a type of wild ginger, and that his grandmother used to make tea from the roots. She listened with an intensity that made him uncomfortable, not because it was unkind, but because it was attention. And attention, for someone like him, was dangerous. There were more conversations. She would appear in the garden at odd hours, claiming she couldn't sleep, and she would sit on the stone bench and watch him work. She asked about his life, his family, his dreams. She told him about loneliness, about what it feels like to be 70 years old and to realize that everyone around you wants something. Money, inheritance, a piece of the legacy. She said she couldn't remember the last time someone had looked at her and seen a person instead of a bank account. Samuel didn't know what to say to that.
He was not a man comfortable with the confessions of the wealthy. But he listened, and in listening, something shifted. She started leaving things for him: a bottle of water on hot days, a sandwich wrapped in foil, once a book of poetry that she said reminded her of the way he talked about plants. He tried to refuse. She insisted. The first time she touched him, it was to steady herself on uneven ground. Her hand on his arm, light, brief, but it lingered in his mind like a question he didn't know how to answer. The second time, it was deliberate. She asked him to help her with something in the greenhouse, and when he turned, she was closer than she should have been. She looked at him with eyes that were both vulnerable and calculating. She said very quietly, "Do you think I'm too old to be wanted?" Samuel should have left. He should have said something kind and distant and returned to the roses. But he didn't, because the truth, the uncomfortable truth, was that he was tired. Tired of being poor. Tired of sending money home and having nothing left. Tired of being invisible. And this woman, this impossibly wealthy woman, was offering him something he had never had: attention, desire, the possibility of being seen.
What happened next happened slowly, then all at once. There were evenings when she called him to the main house under the pretense of moving a plant. There were nights when the staff had been dismissed and she poured wine and talked about her life, and eventually about the fact that she was lonely. There were moments when the line between employer and something else blurred and then disappeared entirely. And then one night, after too much wine and too many confessions, she kissed him, and he, God help him, kissed her back. It became an affair, secret, strange. Samuel told himself it was temporary, that it was just companionship, that she was lonely and he was kind, and that was all it was. But Margaret Whitmore was not a woman who did things halfway. She wanted him, not just physically, though there was that. She wanted him in a way that felt like ownership. She wanted to know where he was, who he spoke to. She started giving him money, not as payment, she said, as gifts, for his family, for his future. Samuel took it because how do you refuse when refusing means going back to nothing? 6 months into the affair, Margaret told him something that made his blood stop. She was pregnant. 70 years old, pregnant. She said it with a kind of wonder that bordered on madness. She said the doctors couldn't believe it, that it shouldn't have been possible, that it was a miracle. Samuel didn't feel wonder, he felt terror, because he knew what this meant. He knew what her family would do. Margaret Whitmore had a sister, Evelyn, 68 years old. She lived in the guest house on the estate and had spent her entire life in Margaret's shadow. Evelyn was the one who managed the household, the one who kept track of the staff and the accounts and the small daily decisions that kept the estate running. She was efficient, cold. She had never married, had never built anything of her own, and had spent decades positioning herself as Margaret's heir. The estate, the money, the legacy, it was all supposed to pass to her. When Evelyn found out about the pregnancy, she didn't scream, she didn't rage, she smiled. A small, tight smile that Samuel would remember for the rest of his life. She said very calmly, "This will be handled." Margaret refused to handle it. She said the baby was hers, that she had every right to decide what happened to her body and her future. She said Samuel was the father and that she intended to acknowledge him. Evelyn said, just as calmly, "You're 70 years old, Margaret. You're not thinking clearly. This is a mistake, and mistakes can be corrected." What followed was 6 months of Cold War. Evelyn began documenting everything: Samuel's hours, his movements. She hired a private investigator to follow him, to see if there was anything in his past that could be used against him. She consulted lawyers about competency, about undue influence, about whether a 70-year-old woman could be considered of sound mind if she claimed to be pregnant by a man 40 years her junior. She planted seeds with the extended family, cousins, nieces, nephews, all of whom depended on Margaret's generosity and all of whom began to worry about what a baby would mean for their own inheritances. Margaret, for her part, became fiercer. She fired staff who she suspected were loyal to Evelyn. She changed locks. She moved Samuel into the main house, which scandalized everyone. She hired her own lawyers and began drafting a new will. She told Evelyn, in front of witnesses, "This child will inherit everything, and there's nothing you can do about it." Evelyn smiled again. "We'll see," she said. Now, before I tell you what happened next, I need you to do something. If you're watching this and you're thinking about what you would do in this situation, hit that like button. If you're thinking about the morality of age gaps, about power, about family, about what people are capable of when their inheritance is threatened, leave a comment. Tell me what you think. Because what comes next isn't just about a will reading. It's about the lengths people will go to protect what they think is theirs. And it's about how truth, when it finally comes out, doesn't always feel like justice. Share this video with someone who needs to understand that family isn't always about love. Sometimes it's about survival. Let's keep going. The pregnancy progressed. 70 years old and pregnant. The doctors monitored her closely. There were risks, of course there were. But Margaret was stubborn. She refused to terminate. She refused to hide. She attended charity events with her belly visible under expensive fabric. She introduced Samuel as the father. The Nairobi social circles, which prided themselves on discretion, didn't know what to do with her. Some admired her audacity. Others whispered about dementia, about manipulation, about a young man taking advantage. Samuel felt all of it. The stares, the whispers. He wanted to leave. More than once he packed a bag and stood at the gate. But Margaret would find him. She would touch his face and say, "Don't let them win. Don't let them make you feel like you're nothing." And he would stay. Because leaving meant admitting that he was what they said he was. A gold digger, an opportunist, a man who had seduced an old woman for money. But here's the thing no one talks about. Samuel had fallen in love with her. Not at first. At first it had been survival, opportunism. But somewhere in those 6 months, in the quiet conversations and the nights when she told him about her life, about her fears, about the fact that she had spent 70 years building an empire and had no one to leave it to, he had started to care. Not because of the money, because of her. Because she was brilliant and lonely and fierce, and because she saw him as more than a gardener. The family saw none of that. They saw a threat. And they began to plan. Evelyn called a family meeting. Margaret was not invited. It was held in the drawing room of the guest house. Evelyn sat at the head of the table, like a judge. Around her were cousins, nieces, nephews, all of whom had been living off Margaret's generosity, and all of whom stood to lose everything if the baby inherited. Evelyn laid out the situation with the precision of a surgeon. Margaret was pregnant. The father was a gardener. The child, if born, would be Margaret's direct heir. The will Margaret was drafting left everything to the child, with Samuel as trustee until the child came of age. This, Evelyn said, was unacceptable. Someone asked what could be done. Evelyn said there were options, legal options. They could challenge Margaret's competency. They could argue undue influence. They could tie the estate up in court for years. Someone else asked if there were other options. Evelyn paused. Then she said, very carefully, "There are always other options. But we must be smart. We must be careful. And we must make sure that whatever we do together." What she meant, though she didn't say it outright, was that they needed Margaret gone before the baby was born. Not killed. Evelyn was too smart for that. But removed. Declared incompetent. Placed under a conservatorship. Made legally unable to control her own affairs. It was possible. With the right doctors, the right lawyers, the right pressure. They began the process. Quietly. Efficiently. They hired a psychiatrist who specialized in elder competency. They arranged for Margaret to be evaluated. They gathered testimonies from staff who were willing to say she had been acting erratically. They built a case. Margaret found out. Of course she did.
She had spent 70 years navigating power. She knew when she was being undermined. She called her own lawyers. She accelerated the drafting of the new will. And she did something else, something no one expected. She called a press conference. She stood in front of cameras and reporters and told them everything. She was 70 years old and pregnant. The father was her gardener. Her family was trying to have her declared incompetent. She said it calmly, without drama, like someone reading a grocery list. She said, "I am of sound mind. I know exactly what I'm doing, and I will not allow my family to steal my life or my child's future." The story went viral. International headlines. A 70-year-old billionaire pregnant by her gardener. The press loved it. Some called it inspiring. Others called it grotesque. The family was furious. Evelyn issued a statement saying Margaret was being manipulated, that Samuel was taking advantage, that the family's only concern was Margaret's well-being. Margaret laughed when she read it. She told Samuel, "They think they can control the narrative. They think money buys silence. But I've spent my entire life learning how to use money.
And I'm going to use every penny I have to make sure this child is protected." She finalized the will. She named Samuel as executor. She left everything, every single asset, to the unborn child. She set up trusts with protections that couldn't be easily challenged. She arranged for Samuel to have access to funds for the child's care. She did it all legally, carefully, with witnesses and lawyers who understood what was at stake. And then, 2 weeks before the baby was due, Margaret Whitmore died. Not in childbirth, in her sleep. Peacefully, the doctors said. Her heart had simply stopped. She was 70 years old. She had been pregnant. Her body had endured more than it should have. It was, they said, not unexpected. Samuel didn't believe them. He knew what had happened. Not murder, necessarily, but neglect, stress, the constant pressure from the family, the legal battles, the public scrutiny. They had killed her without laying a hand on her. They had killed her with paperwork and whispers and the slow, relentless grind of people who wanted her gone. The baby was delivered by emergency cesarean. The girl, alive, healthy. Samuel held her in the hospital and felt a grief so large it had no name. Margaret had died for this child, had fought for her, had spent her final months making sure she would be protected. And now Samuel was alone with a newborn, a family that hated him, and a will that was about to be read in front of the world. The will reading was scheduled for 2 weeks after Margaret's death. It was held in a conference room at the offices of her primary law firm. The room was large, sterile, filled with too many chairs. The family arrived first. Evelyn, cousins, nieces, nephews, all dressed in black, all wearing expressions that tried to look like grief but looked more like anticipation. Samuel arrived with the baby. He had no one else, no family, no allies, just a 2-week-old child and a lawyer Margaret had hired to represent him. The press was there too, not inside the room, but outside. Cameras, reporters. This was news, a billionaire's will reading, a scandal that had captivated the country. Everyone wanted to know what would happen. The lawyer who read the will was a woman named Catherine Omondi. She had been Margaret's attorney for 30 years. She knew every clause, every provision. She sat at the head of the table with the will in front of her like a holy text. She looked around the room and said, "Before I begin, I want to make something clear. Margaret Whitmore was of sound mind when she drafted this will. It was witnessed, notarized, legal in every respect. Any challenges to its validity will be met with the full force of the legal protections she put in place." Evelyn's lawyer started to object. Catherine held up a hand. "You'll have your chance, but first you're going to listen." She began to read. The first pages were standard. Bequests to charities, small gifts to longtime staff. Then she reached the primary clause. The one everyone had been waiting for. She read it slowly, clearly, so there could be no misunderstanding. I leave the entirety of my estate, including all properties, investments, and liquid assets, to my daughter, Grace Margaret Whitmore. In the event of her minority, Samuel Kimani is named as trustee and guardian with full authority to manage the estate on her behalf until she reaches the age of 25. The room erupted. Evelyn stood. This is absurd. That child isn't even proven to be Margaret's biological daughter. This is fraud. Catherine didn't flinch. There's more, she said. She produced a folder. Inside were documents, medical records, DNA tests conducted before Margaret's death, proof that Grace was biologically Margaret's child, proof that Samuel was the father. All of it legally documented, all of it irrefutable. Margaret knew you would challenge this, Catherine said, looking directly at Evelyn. She knew you would question the child's paternity. She knew you would try to claim the will was invalid, so she made sure there was no room for doubt. But that wasn't all. Catherine produced another set of documents. These were recordings, audio files, transcripts. Margaret had recorded conversations with Evelyn, with other family members, conversations where they discussed having her declared incompetent, where they talked about removing Samuel, where they calculated how to divide the estate once she was gone. Catherine played them, right there, in front of everyone. The family's voices, cold and calculating, discussing Margaret like she was already dead, discussing how to handle Samuel, how to make sure the baby, if born, wouldn't inherit. The room went silent. The family's faces drained of color. Evelyn tried to speak. Catherine cut her off. Margaret also left instructions, Catherine said. She wanted me to make sure everyone understood what this family tried to do to her. She wanted the truth on record, and she wanted to make sure that if anything happened to her, if she died before the baby was born, everyone would know exactly what you did. Evelyn's lawyer stood. This is slander. These recordings were obtained illegally. They were obtained by Margaret Whitmore, Catherine said, in her own home, recording conversations she was party to, entirely legal and entirely damning. The press, which had been waiting outside, was given copies of the transcripts. Within hours, the story had shifted. It was no longer about a gold-digging gardener. It was about a family that had tried to steal an old woman's fortune, that had harassed her, pressured her, possibly contributed to her death. The backlash was immediate. The family's reputation, which had been built on decades of philanthropy and social standing, collapsed. Donors withdrew. Boards asked for resignations. The cousins and nieces and nephews who had depended on Margaret's money found themselves cut off and publicly shamed. Evelyn tried to fight. She hired lawyers. She challenged the will. She argued that Margaret had been manipulated. But every challenge was met with more evidence, more recordings, more documentation. Margaret had spent her final months building an unassailable case. She had known she was going to die, and she had made sure that when she did, her daughter would be protected. The legal battles dragged on for 2 years, but in the end, the will stood. Grace inherited everything. Samuel, as trustee, managed the estate. He didn't become rich. The money was Grace's, held in trust. But he had access to what he needed to raise her, to give her a life Margaret had wanted for her. Samuel never remarried. He raised Grace on the estate, in the house where her mother had lived. He taught her about plants, about soil, about the fact that her mother had been a woman who fought for her even before she was born. He showed her the recordings, the transcripts. He made sure she understood that family wasn't always about blood. Sometimes it was about who fought for you. Grace grew up knowing the truth, that her mother had been 70 years old and defiant, that her father had been a gardener who had loved an impossible woman, that a will reading had been the moment when everything came to light, and that sometimes Justice doesn't look like happiness. Sometimes it just looks like survival. The Whitmore family never recovered. Evelyn lived out her final years in the guest house, alone, stripped of the influence she had spent her life cultivating. The cousins and nieces and nephews scattered, taking what little they had left. The estate, which had once been a symbol of legacy, became something else. A place where a child learned to garden, where truth had been more powerful than money. If this story moved you, if it made you think about what family really means, about power and age and the lengths people will go to protect what they think is theirs, subscribe to this channel, share this video, leave a comment and tell me what you would have done. Because stories like this don't just entertain, they remind us that the people we trust can sometimes be the ones who hurt us most, and that sometimes a single document can change everything. Thank you for listening.